Ryan, go. Good evening. My name is Keith Marks. I'm the Executive Director for Next Stage Arts in Putney, Vermont. Thank you for joining us tonight and for taking an active role in fighting for our democracy. I am honored to host this evening's panel with the help and support of a number of organizations, and I want to give them a bit of praise for being involved tonight as co-presenters. The Vermont ACLU, VPIRG, the Vermont League of Women's Voters, Disability Rights Vermont, and the Jonathan Daniels Center for Social Responsibility. And I really want to give a shout out to our technical production support of BCTV for being here. All Americans should have free and fair access to the ballot box, and yet sadly, voting doesn't extend to everyone equally, and the battle for the ballot still exists today. Tonight, we will watch a short documentary film on voter suppression, then sit down with an impressive group of panelists to discuss the topics: democracy in the time of COVID, voter rights, and how we keep elections open to all. We'll open this evening's discussion with a short documentary film, Voter Fraudbusters, which captures in frightening detail the deception of an illegal voter purge in North Carolina in 2016. This short film is an excerpt from the award-winning feature documentary, Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Voter Fraudbusters is cinema verite and runs approximately 14 minutes. Thank you.
If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Thanks. Hey, if you care about vote fraud, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Thank you. If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Thanks. Thank you.
I know a girl who votes 8 times and has $1 million in the bank and is on food stamps and gets everything for free, including college.
How do you know she votes 8 times?
Because we know her. She does.
Would you call me later? Before I launched the Voter Integrity Project, I was a military officer, retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. I became worried that this is a fragile system that depends on people being fair and honest. If you're worried about vote fraud, here's how we're fighting it tomorrow. We could use your help. They're hiding something, and we're on to them. And that's the only question. It's not how many, we know they're doing it. The question is, how big a deal is it? Are they really trying to steal an entire nation?
And a lot of people are going through life with blinders on, or like I used to tell people, it's called the toilet paper tube syndrome. You got toilet paper tubes in front of your eyes, and all you see is that little bit of world right out in front of you through the toilet paper tubes. You don't see what all's going on out here. So if you're looking right here and you're not looking for voter fraud, you won't see voter fraud.
My name is Michael Evan Hires. I'm a 100% disabled veteran. I'm not married. I have the time, I have the skills, and have a desire to make sure that every American vote is legally cast.
The Voting Integrity Project is interesting. They've always had a bit of a gadfly, renegade, vigilante voter fraud, crusaders. They claimed that thousands of non-citizens were voting in the state where they would challenge voters at county boards of elections, and then they couldn't prove that really any of those were true.
It's about time we turned the lights on in the kitchen and started cleaning the cockroaches out of here.
Is there anyone in the audience today who received a notice that if they wish their name not to be removed from the voter rolls, they should be present? Stand up then and give us your name, please, ma'am.
Randy Burkett.
Jamie. Okay, sir. John McKee.
Well, North Carolina has a provision where a citizen can challenge the right of another citizen to vote. It's been on the books forever. Who else is going to know who's registered to vote unless another citizen does it?
Some of the laws that wind up being discriminatory today had discriminatory intent when they were first written in the early 1900s as part of the Jim Crow laws. For example, voter purging laws to cleanse the rolls.
And this was typically used in the Jim Crow era by whites who were trying to prevent newly enfranchised African Americans from having access to the ballot box.
Michael's methodology involves finding voters that the state identified as inactive.
These people have missed 2 federal elections, so they were listed as inactive. And I started sending letters to these inactive voters on the Cumberland County voter rolls.
The ones that came back marked by the post office as undeliverable are considered evidence that the voter no longer resides at that address. And Mike challenged those voters.
What the letter essentially says to PIRG to maintain my voter registration as it is currently today. Whoever this guy is has challenged my right to vote. The only way to defend your registration was to go in person. The process heavily favors the person doing the challenging. Not everybody is going to get a letter or have the time to defend it.
What do you want this board to know concerning your place of residence?
My primary place of residence is the address on my voter registration.
Yeah, I'll make a motion that the challenge to Ms. Burkett be dismissed.
Second. Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The challenge against you is dismissed. Your voter registration remains. Now let's move on to Mr. John Lamont McKeithen Jr.
Some people have the knack of spotting anomalies. It's kind of like seeing a lump of coal in a bale of cotton. It'll just pop right out at you.
Let me just ask you, what do you want this board to know concerning your place of residence?
I do live and have lived at 7790 Stony Point Road.
It said 7790.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this says 7770.
Is there a possibility that people got struck from the rolls mistakenly because the post office did not appropriately deliver the mailings to them? There is a small possibility on that.
Challenges shall not be made indiscriminately.
I love the vote. It was instilled in us to vote. My grandma raised me up and my sister up to vote. You know, when we turned 18, that was our right. The address when I registered was 7660 Bridgewood Circle.
I'm gonna have you go and stand in that line so they can update you.
Okay.
All right. Next voter, please.
I need to make sure I do.
I got an old one until I
see what you have. Karen, is this your address? You're not doing a video. You got something we can't do address.
She told me I could not vote at all because I got to re-register because I'm nowhere in that system. They're not making it easy at all. It's tiresome, yeah. When I found out that I was purged off the rolls, and I was highly upset about it. Because, like I said, I grew up seeing my family vote. I know it's my God-given right today to vote, and I want to vote.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give concerning this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All the evidence shows that when someone is purged from the rolls, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to re-register. It's hard to get them to re-register. And I worry that it will diminish the will to participate in the political process.
And the danger is if states use unreliable information to take voters off the rolls, and if they do not give voters adequate notice and an opportunity to contest their removal, then we could have a situation where hundreds or even thousands of legitimate voters are being taken off of the rolls without their knowledge.
Good morning. Persons were engaging in an attempt to get voters purged, especially African Americans. We are fighting this. We believe and we hope that the courts will agree with us and we will have an immediate temporary restraining order.
Reverend Barber, that guy's made a name for himself. Congratulate him on a well-funded. He has a lot of out-of-state funding money, and he knows how to play that race card better than anybody I've seen, and really since the heyday of Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, he has played that race card so well.
The NAACP filed a voter suppression lawsuit against the North Carolina Board of Elections, and today they won that case with a federal judge declaring that all voters purged from the voting rolls must be reinstated.
The NAACP in North Carolina, they filed a lawsuit in federal court, and actually they went judge shopping. They found a black female judge that they could influence emotionally, in my opinion, and not so humble opinion at that.
Those of us who are the descendants of people who had their cars blown up outside of churches right here in North Carolina when they were inside the church organizing for voting rights, When you come from that kind of lineage, you're not going to allow some loudmouth bigot to intimidate you.
The courts have said, you know, you can't do any of this kind of stuff in the last 90 days. But they're going to put all these names back on the roll. We had a guy who worked for 2 years and got over 6,000 names removed in Cumberland County.
And they claimed that we were targeting blacks. I would be glad to get drug into federal court because that will give me the opportunity to expose the problems that we have in this state. I get 3 hots and a cot and full medical care if I go to jail. Except how are you going to put me in jail for following the law?
It's a Tuesday morning, but not just any Tuesday morning, Election Day.
Good morning, America. Election Day 2016.
Election Day officially starts right now.
So who did you vote for? Tough decision.
If Hillary wins, I'm done, probably. I don't know what will happen, but it scares the crap out of me because if she wins, I'm afraid I'll be hunted down like a dog.
Michael Evan Hires.
If you'll just verify that your address and information is correct, make your sign at the bottom for us, please.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Morning. My name's Michael Hires.
Michael Hires. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, you may not think so when you go back and research my name, but I'm the fellow that's been filing the voter challenges. Let's face it, there are unscrupulous people out there, and they could go to the polls and impersonate somebody. I tell you what,
It's a pleasure.
if I could get more people of all, I don't hate to say race because we're all the human race,
Yes.
but more ethnic backgrounds involved in this, that way people wouldn't be taking pot shots at me. The NAACP is hot as a pistol at me right now, claiming I'm suppressing the black vote.
Well, I think you would.
They're accusing me of targeting minorities.
Oh, okay.
They're throwing mud on the wall and trying to get it to stick.
Really piqued my curiosity.
But if you're interested in getting involved, look up voterintegrityproject.com.
I will remember that. Right now, I have to go on and wait for work.
Okay. Well, have a good day.
Have a wonderful day.
What we're going to try and do is have data collectors sitting there passively collecting data on license plate numbers, see if we can figure out which people, if any, are going from voting location to voting location. The illegitimate reason would be if someone is what we call a serial voter and going from location A to B to C, using a different name at each one. And what we want to know is how prevalent is this?
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
Emergency, call me.
Can I talk about one state that's going to come up at 7 o'clock that we have?
So what we could do is call the State Board of Elections and have them intervene, but I just called somebody with an undercover camera. The bottom line is we're trying to collect evidence of voter impersonation fraud. This is what I call criminal enterprise level vote fraud. You see any vote fraud?
Not yet.
I gotta take this. Hey, Jim.
Have you seen any fraud, heard of any fraud?
No, we have not. No, with only 6 data collectors, the odds of getting someone who showed up at 2 locations are slim and none.
And Mike Hires.
Basically, if you want to challenge me, please contact me first. A challenge is a challenge, and if I challenge you to a chess match, I need you to play with me. At least come back, and show me what you got. So.
And until we can say, without doubt, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, until that means exactly what it says, we are still
working toward becoming a more perfect union.
Welcome back to our program. If you haven't already seen the entire documentary film Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, I would highly encourage all of you to watch it. You can watch it online for free. Now let me introduce our esteemed panel. First, I want to mention Paul Burns. He's the Executive Director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, otherwise known as VPIRG. It's a position he's held since 2001. VPIRG is Vermont's largest nonprofit consumer and environmental advocacy organization. Paul leads VPIRG's work on democracy issues and has a law degree from Syracuse University. Brianna is the CEO and co-founder of Generation Vote. She is a skilled youth organizer and voting rights advocate and passionate about empowering young people in the political process and expanding youth voting rights. In her day job, Brianna is a senior research and program associate at the Brennan Center for Justice. Jim Condos, our Secretary of State of Vermont, has served in that role for the past 10 years. He has an impressive record of achievement during his more than 30 years of elected public service and has worked as Secretary of State to identify and dismantle barriers to the ballot box for Vermont voters. Secretary of Condos is currently running for re-election to his 6th term. Falko Schilling joined the ACLU of Vermont in its advocacy director in July 2019. He has been working to promote positive social change in Vermont since 2009. A native of Vermont, Falko received his law degree from Vermont Law School after attending Skidmore College. And finally, the panel's moderator is Tim Smith. Tim is the executive producer of Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, in addition to the documentary short film Voter Fraudbusters that we just watched. He has worked for MSNBC, Newsweek Productions, PBS NewsHour, and now the American Issues Initiative. In all, Mr. Smith has won 2 Emmys, 5 Emmy nominations, 2 Gracie Awards. Tim, I'm happy to hand the panel over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Take 2. Thank you, Keith. And thanks to Next Stage Arts for hosting this event. Again, our topic for tonight's discussion is democracy in the time of COVID-19 and how America will adapt to voting and maintaining a democracy during a raging pandemic. I ask our audience members to post their questions on the YouTube live chat function, and we will get to them after a few questions from me. I also ask our panelists to try and keep their answers to under 2 minutes. So my first question is for Falko. As shown by the film, can you discuss how voter suppression tactics have become less overt and more covert than in the Jim Crow era, for instance, yet that seem equally effective and detrimental to our democracy?
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate being here. I will try and keep this to 2 minutes, though. As you can see, there's an hour and plus long documentary that goes over all of this that I hope you'll watch. So in many ways, what has happened over the last couple of years is there's been attempts to make changes to state-based laws around voting that are meant to be neutral on their face, but are meant to have disparate impacts that are meant to disproportionately disenfranchise people of color, young people, and people who live in places that are traditionally more democratic leaning. And this includes a wide range of laws. Many of these changes have been allowed because the Supreme Court rolled back some of the federal oversight that was contained in the Voting Rights Act. The Roberts Court did this in 2013 in the Shelby versus Holder case. And so we've seen a number of different ways this is happening. One is gerrymandering, where people are either packing people into a district so where they might otherwise be able to influence more than one seat, they only have influence over one seat in an election. Another is cracking districts, where people are either, you'll cherry pick small portions of populations, put them with other populations where their vote will not have the same impact it would, creating in many ways an opportunity for minorities to gain more seats within legislatures. Other very detrimental changes have been voter ID laws, specifically photo voter ID laws aimed directly at communities of color, students, people who might be new and moving to a state. People and legislators often knew exactly what they're doing with these laws when they're intending to try and disenfranchise people who they think might not be voting for them. Other than that, there's the voter purges, which we saw previously in the documentary, as well as a host of other ways that people have tried to disenfranchise people from their right to vote. This includes things like reducing the number of polling places in traditionally Democratic areas, things like eliminating, recently in terms of COVID, eliminating drop boxes for election ballots, where you'll have, say, all right, Texas just did this. They say one ballot box per county. You might have one county with 4,000 people, another county with 2 million people. And they say, well, that's just all the same. It looks the same on its face with it. And then there's a number of other things around mail-in voting in terms of witnessing requirements, limiting the time that ballots can be counted. But those are just a number of the different ways that we've seen state legislatures around the country systematically trying to make it harder for people to vote, when what we should be doing now is make it easier for people to vote.
Quick sort of follow-up question. Is Vermont an open carry state? I know there are some states where, there will be voter intimidation with President Trump sort of encouraging people to kind of watch the polls, and some people will be watching the polls with guns. Is Vermont a place that would allow that?
Vermont is, and I think this actually might be a great question for Secretary Condos, since he just released a memo on this along with the Attorney General, where they've talked about the threats that might come and the need to make sure there is not intimidation at the polls. So I know this is something that people will be watching very closely in our state. But this is, it is a concern, but there's efforts underway to make sure that voter intimidation does not happen here in Vermont.
Okay, great. Thank you, Falko. Secretary Condos, sort of a follow-up to you. We all saw what happened during, the primaries in Georgia and Wisconsin, where there were long lines and it just didn't go very well. What is Vermont doing to sort of prevent some of the catastrophes that happened with voting in the age of COVID, where, you can't get enough poll workers and where people are afraid of voting in person, but the mail-in infrastructure maybe not be in place?
So that's a great question. And frankly, we worked with a lot of the panelists here, with Paul, with Falko, on the Brennan Center, as we were preparing for this fall. But going back to late February and early March, when COVID started to rear its ugly head, we really began to immediately plan for the worst. We had two overarching goals during that time period, and continues today, to preserve the voting rights of every eligible Vermonter and protect the health and safety of voters, candidates, town clerks, and their community poll workers. And as you described, there were many long lines and voters in close quarters, risking exposure to vote in some of the state primaries that existed. No voter should ever have to choose between their health and their right to vote. So we worked with the legislature. I know Paul Burns and Falko were there with me to help convince them to pass Acts 92 and 135 this past spring, that provided my office the authority to be flexible and nimble in order to ensure safe voting going into the year. For the low turnout lower turnout August primary, we mailed a postcard with a return postage paid ballot request form to every voter. That was twofold. One was we didn't have time to put in a vote by mail system at that point. There were too many logistics that had to be resolved. But we wanted to do something that encouraged voters. Well, the previous high voter turnout for an August primary was 122,000. We had 125,000 people who voted by mail and 174,000 overall who voted. So we smashed the turnout record for the statewide primary. And going into the general election, we switched our focus to the vote by mail, where we directly mailed a ballot to all active registered voters. And I can tell you that as of yesterday evening, we had over 166,000 Vermonters who have already returned their voted ballots. And to just put that in comparison, in 2016, the last presidential election, we had a total of 320,000. So we're 50%, a little over 50% of what the total turnout was. And we still have 2 weeks left, roughly 2 weeks left to go. So we've created number safe voting options for Vermonters. And as a result, no one will be forced into that difficult decision of risking exposure. So what we've done is we identified the vote by mail process to really be an additional option to voters. Vermont does not have voter ID. Vermont does not have, we do have same day voter registration, automatic voter registration. We worked with the Brennan Center on passing the automatic voter registration several years ago. And I expect that come this January, we will have some serious discussions with the legislature about making vote by mail permanent. I guess I just want to end by what my philosophy as Vermont Secretary of State is. In one, it's to ensure that our elections are fair, free, and accurate. That I believe strongly that the more eligible Vermonters who actually get to vote, the stronger is our democracy. That the true voter fraud in this country is the denial of the opportunity for any eligible American to participate in our elections process. That no voter should have to choose between their health and their right to vote. And I'll just end it by saying your vote is your voice. Please exercise it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. Brianna, younger people, there are some younger people, obviously not you, who question the value of voting, saying that even when people do vote, nothing seems to change. That systemic racism continues, the seas still rise, and the fires of inequity still burn. Do you have an answer for these younger people who kind of doubt the validity of voting?
Yeah, and again, just thank you so much for having all of us here. And I appreciate, being on such an amazing panel. So just wanted to say that first and foremost. Yeah, so, I think the first thing I say to them is that their skepticism is totally warranted. Especially, Tim, when I hear you describe like all the challenges that our generation is facing as a Gen Zer, right? And when I was on the streets in Brooklyn this summer with the movement for Black Lives, I grappled with this question all the time. But I was really encouraged this time around by the amount of young people on the streets who understood the importance of voting and movement building. So my answer is basically this. These institutions were not built for people that look like us, that look like me. And voter suppression ensures that. But times are changing. After this 2020 census, which I hope everyone who's watching this filled out, by the way, our generation will be the most diverse generation that our country has ever seen. And if we want those in office to reflect our generation's communities and our priorities, we need to vote like our lives depend on it. I think a lot of young people understand that and are coming to be more politically aware during a time when our nation is grappling with the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racism. And it puts a spotlight for many young people on how broken our democracy and criminal justice systems are. It's clear to a lot of young folks that I talk to every day that they think our politicians have failed us. But my response to that, again, is that we're living in a historic moment, and we will be the generation that lives with the consequences of this burning world that you described, Tim, and an uncertain economy for many folks who are graduating, this upcoming year. And so if we want things like a Green New Deal, affordable housing, a job, and getting big money out of politics, we need to vote, but also think about reforming our democracy and reimagining how young people come to age in the United States. And so that's pretty much my answer. And I hope that motivates folks to not only vote, but also get involved in the fight for voting rights and watch amazing films like Rigged.
Oh, thank you. Hey, Paul, I want to come to you now. One of the issues in this election is obviously voter fraud. And when we shot Rigged, Trump was talking about rigged elections, but he was talking about fraud at the polling place. Now he's talking about fraud and vote by mail, which is obviously a key part of sort of dealing with this COVID epidemic. What do you say to, is voter fraud something that, voters should worry about? Because I know they've done polls and over 50% of people think voter fraud is a real issue. So what do you say to voters that are concerned about the integrity of our elections?
Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks to you and Keith for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. A great group. And it is an important question, I think, that you ask about fraud. Let's first talk about what fraud is. Remember that it's essentially an attempt to defraud the election system. And that might mean casting a ballot that isn't yours. It might mean changing or destroying a ballot that doesn't belong to you. It might mean voting more than once in a single election. Those are examples of fraud. President Trump, as you mentioned, talked a lot about fraud that he believed took place in the 2016 election, talked of 3 to 5 million people voting illegally in that race. And recall, he lost that election, lost the popular vote of that election by about 3 million votes. He created afterwards an election integrity commission, investigated this.
With Chris Kobach.
Exactly, so people can look up who that is. But he found no evidence, zero evidence of any kind of widespread fraud. And in fact, voter fraud, as the president talks about it, or his allies talk about it, is truly a myth in this country. There have been plenty of research that shows that actual fraud in the United States is exceedingly rare. And that's true whether you're talking about voting in person or voting by mail. And one of the reasons why it's exceedingly rare is that there are laws against it. If you attempt to defraud our election system, you are subjecting yourself potentially to very serious penalties or jail time. And that's as it should be. I mean, there should be really serious consequences if you're trying to mess with our election system. But there's just no evidence that is taking place on any kind of significant scale in this country. I want to give a shout out to the Brennan Center. They've done terrific research on this topic, as others have. You can easily find it by doing a little bit of research there. The bottom line, I like the way they put this, is that as an American, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to impersonate another voter at the polls. Look, the problem for democracy, as Secretary Condos said, is not voter fraud. It is suppression of the vote from people who are citizens of this country.
Okay, thanks a lot. Falko, let me come back to you. One of the things in our film in 2016 that we talk about is how the federal courts really kind of stopped a lot of the sort of voter suppression laws that have been passed, striking down the voter ID in Wisconsin and also in North Carolina and in Texas. But this time around, obviously the last 4 years, Trump and the U.S. Senate have appointed, I think, over a quarter of the federal judges. The recent decision on Amendment 4 in Florida, where they agreed to ask that felons pay their court fees and fines before they could register to vote. That was a 5-4 decision, and I think 4 of the judges that decided that were Trump appointees. So you at the ACLU, you're bringing a lot of these court cases. What are you finding when you sort of bring these cases to court? Is the federal court sort of the friend of voting rights that they used to be, or has that changed?
Well, over the last couple of years, we have seen that tide turning, and I think you point to a number of the causes of it. Overall, the Roberts Court has not been a big friend of those who are supporting voting rights, and one of the most landmark cases is repealing sections of the Voting Rights Act that would give federal oversight to states that had a history of disenfranchising, disenfranchising voters based on the color of their skin. So in the wake of that, we saw measure after measure being enacted by state legislatures, which did exactly that, aim to disenfranchise more people. And what we've seen over the last couple of years since Donald Trump has been elected, and after Mitch McConnell refused to appoint judicial nominees under the Obama administration, we've seen Donald Trump do exactly what you were saying, which is appoint 25% of the federal bench. And we now have seen a pattern throughout this election as well, where you have a number of cases where you have a lower federal court issuing a decision. So cases like that in Florida, where a lower federal court said, this is essentially a new poll tax. This cannot stand. Or in Texas, where you say, you can't just put one ballot drop box in a county with 2 million people and put one in a county with 4,000 people and say that's the same. These lower court decisions are then overturned by appellate judges who have been recently appointed under this Republican administration. So over the last couple of years, we have seen a shift for more and more people at the appellate level within the federal courts being more and more hostile towards voting rights. And we're also seeing that on the Supreme Court. Over this last season, for the large part, there have not been major victories in terms of voting rights at the Supreme Court. There was a recent victory. The recent decision that came out this week regarding Pennsylvania and their ability to count absentee ballots later, but that was a 4-4 decision.
Right.
What it was really doing was upholding the ruling that had come from the previous court. That was not making law. And many of these actions, they will decline to take action under the guise of saying we shouldn't make major changes as we lead up to an election. Yet that rule seems to go out the window sometimes when it is going to be used to help disenfranchise people. So, ACLU is of course a nonpartisan organization, but what we have seen over the last couple of years, over the last decade, is a move towards making the federal bench more and more conservative, and especially under Donald Trump, where he's appointed 25% of the appellate judges in the United States federal courts, which could have a chilling effect on voting rights for years to come.
And now has his 3rd Supreme Court appointment. Secretary Condos, can you compare and contrast the right to vote in Vermont versus some of the other states? Obviously election laws are done on a state-by-state basis. Some states are much more open to allowing people to vote. Florida, for instance, as I referenced earlier, has once again sort of denied the right to vote to 1.3 million felons, many of them, Black and Hispanic. So can you just sort of talk about that? And also sort of following up to that Falko question I asked about voter intimidation. Is that something that can happen in Vermont with open carry? And, because we hear about it most likely happening in Michigan, for instance.
So first, let me take that first part of that, your last question first. And Vermont is an open carry state, but I can tell you that law enforcement and my team have been meeting now for several weeks, doing some exercises and understanding and making sure we have the protocols in place to be able to address it should we see anything that happens. So far, nobody in law enforcement, and law enforcement includes U.S. attorneys, FBI, the state police, state's attorneys, the attorney general, my office, and some of the locals. And we're not seeing anything at this point, but we are certainly going to be looking out for it as we go. Unfortunately, I think we've heard and seen, since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, we've seen a renewed wave of voter suppression efforts and discriminatory voter laws, and they've been described. Here in Vermont, we've taken a completely opposite approach, and I hope you'll agree with me that we are leading by example. For instance, and Brianna, you'd like this, 17-year-olds in Vermont can vote in primaries if they turn 18 by the general election. We have same-day voter registration. We have automatic voter registration. In 2009, we extended our 30-day early vote period to 45 days to match the federal mandate for overseas and military voters. We have a unique voter page. It's called the My Voter page for each registered voter, which has things like confirms their address, tells them who their town clerk is that oversees the election, how to get a hold of them, contact information, provides a sample ballot. They can order an early vote ballot that way if they want to. They can also track their ballot from the time it was ordered to the time it was sent to them to the time it was received back and its status. So we have all those things in place. We have online voter registration. And we're really proud of the stuff that we've done. Vermont does not have restrictive voter ID laws, as I said earlier. Many of these laws have actually been struck down by as unconstitutional by the courts in other states. And we have never, Vermont is one of 2 states, Vermont and Maine, that has never stripped their people with felonies or incarceration of the fundamental right to vote. This year we have for years worked with the League of Women Voters, but we engaged the Department of Corrections as well. So we've made a very big outreach to incarcerated individuals, and we believe that this is the right thing to do. But we can't rest on our laurels, obviously, and I think we must continue to identify and tear down barriers to the registration and voting process. As I said, I work closely with both the ACLU, with VPIRG, with the Brennan Center, and others. As a past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, I have strong contacts across the country, so I'm able to gather ideas, bounce ideas off of others, and just see what is being done out there and how we could maybe do it better. But let me give you 2 examples of what we've done in the last couple of years. 2 years ago, we implemented a brand new, innovative, accessible voting system, which is not just ADA compliant, but allows voters with disabilities to mark their ballots privately and without assistance, using a variety of assistive devices and even using their own assistive devices at their home computers. My office also worked with the community leaders in Burlington and the city of Winooski, the New American Communities, on a language pilot project. Vermont does not cross any federal mandate threshold for limited or no English proficiency. We're not even close, but we thought it was the right thing to do. So we worked with the New American Communities in those 2 communities, which are probably the most diverse in Vermont. And we've translated sample ballots into 6 different languages. We've provided instructional voter videos in the same languages. And we had 2 large pre-COVID voter outreach and education events, which were highly attended. So we're always looking for ways that we can expand the right to vote to all who are eligible. And I think I'll end right there.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. Hey, Brianna, I want to come back to you. Can you talk about how voter suppression impacts younger voters, particularly college students? For instance, right next door to Vermont, I mean, New Hampshire's been pretty tough on letting college students vote. Can you sort of speak to those issues?
Yeah, and also first off, man, Secretary of State Condos, as a New Yorker, I am so jealous to hear. I am so jealous to hear how Vermont is leading the way for voting reform. Because in New York, we are just catching up after passing our first voting reforms in over 100 years in 2019. So kudos to Vermont. We're looking to y'all as leaders. So just wanted to say that.
And here in Connecticut, there's no early voting. So, which is an all Democratic state. So go figure.
Oh yeah, we got lots of work to do in the Northeast even. So yeah, in regards to the question, just to provide some context for folks, in 2018, our generation, young people, really rocked the vote. On election day, young people broke records with 31% of young folks showing up to the polls. And in some states, young people actually turned out in greater numbers than the general electorate. I believe in Vermont, the youth turnout rate was 29%, which is pretty high. In New York, our youth turnout rate was only 16.4%. So, but after the historic youth turnout of the 2018 midterms, local governments across the country have moved to suppress the youth vote. And this has brought to light a broader movement to silence our voices even before the 2018 midterms, which was touched upon by several of the panelists earlier. These challenges disproportionately affect young voters of color. And if you watch the full-length RIG documentary, you'll see that many of the voter suppression tactics used against young voters are the very same tactics used to suppress the vote in communities of color. In some states, they have even gone so far to target young Black and Brown voters, such as gerrymandering HBCUs like Prairie View A&M and North Carolina A&T University. So from New Hampshire to New York to Texas and Wisconsin, we've seen young people be forced to jump over these hurdles to exercise their right to vote. For example, they can't find polling sites close to campus. In some states, we can't use student IDs or out-of-state driver's licenses, but a handgun license is considered a valid ID. And in the case of Connecticut, we've seen instances where young people have actually showed up to the polls and were told to go back home because they're not from that community. And so that happened right up here in the Northeast. And we saw the effects of these voter suppression laws against young people in full force in the 2020 primaries. Like Tim mentioned, young people turned out to vote in a New Hampshire primary without knowing whether or not they were penalized for breaking the law, because there was an attempt to suppress the youth vote by requiring folks to register with the New Hampshire DMV. And a lot of young people don't have vehicles, right? They don't bring cars to campus.
Right.
And so that disproportionately affected young voters. In Texas, where they took a lot of early voting sites away from college campuses, some students had to wait on 6-hour lines in this past spring. And in 7 states across the country, you can't vote by mail unless you're over the age of 65. So that affects all people under the age of 65, right? So I share all of this, quick youth vote 101, because coast to coast, the youth voter suppression crisis is real. And I think we're gonna see more of this in not only the lead up to the presidential election and beyond. So happy to answer any questions, folks, about this moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Brianna. Hey, Paul, what is VPIRG doing to make it easier for Vermonters to vote this fall? And what are you guys doing to protect the vote?
Well, first of all, we are working with others. So my organization, VPIRG, has members all across the state. We've got 50,000 members and supporters all around Vermont. But if you want to be effective at getting more people to participate, it means working with as many other partners as possible. And I first want to say working with Secretary of State Condos and his staff has been critical. They have just been tremendous over the years in identifying barriers or potential barriers to voting and identifying ways to get rid of those barriers. And I won't repeat all of those, but I'll just say that it has been my pleasure to be a part of the process of trying to make Vermont the place where I think as a state, it is easier to vote in Vermont than it is any other place in this country. And we should be proud of that. There's more to do, but as you've heard, we've already done a lot of things to try to make voting as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. But still, we always face the challenge of trying to make sure that people who have a right to vote actually exercise that right. So we have created something called the Vote Safe Vermont Coalition and Campaign, and we're working with many other groups, including groups on this call, and ACLU and League of Women Voters, Rights and Democracy, Disability Rights, Justice for All, a very broad cross-section of Vermont organizations to try to reach out to, connect with as many people as possible and encourage them to exercise that right. So one of the things that we have done is create videos and a whole lot of information. In fact, if you look at the Vote Safe Vermont, there'll be a link in the comments section there. You'll find all sorts of information about how to properly exercise your right to vote, particularly if you're a person who is voting safely from home for the first time this year. It's not terribly complicated, but you want to make sure that you do it the right way, including signing that envelope so that your vote is counted. And that's just critically important. We've also created a database of the official drop boxes that are established in many towns across the state. For people who may not want to use the US mail for one reason or another, many of the clerks have set up drop boxes, and you'll find a link to that on our website as well. We do all this to make sure that people find it as easy as possible to participate in the process. I also wanted to note that VPIRG created the Vote Safe Ambassador Program. And the theory here is that people tend to vote when they are reminded or invited to vote by somebody that they know, a family member or a friend. It may sound hokey, but it is actually true. And there's evidence to back this up. And so we've created a program, and you'll find a link to this as well. It's a really simple idea where if you pledge to remind 3 people to vote in this election, you get a great mask. It says vote on it, and that's cool, something we want to wear and help to publicize. But the important thing is that you are part of a program where we now have about 700 people in the state who have already signed up to do this, to encourage 3 friends or family members to participate in this election by voting. And that is going to be one of the things that we help to drive up participation. A lot of young people and young organizations, sports teams in high school and college are participating in this. And that's one of the things that we're really excited about.
So Paul,
yeah.
what website should people go to?
There's you'll see links to it in the comments section, but there's Vote Safe Vermont, and then there's the Vote Safe Ambassador link as well. And so both of those should be in the comments section.
Okay, great. Keith, I'm going to turn it back to you. Keith is going to sort of take the questions that you have posted in the chat function on YouTube, and it's still not too late to put up additional questions. So Keith, let me turn it back to you. And I want to thank my panelists for being here and for doing a great job. Thank you all so much. But Keith, back to you.
Tim, thank you. And just so we're all clear, this all began by connecting with Tim and seeing his film, Rigged, the voter suppression playbook. And so I want to give a big kudos. If we were in the theater, if we could be in the theater, we'd give you a big round of applause. But the film is great. And if you haven't seen it, please make it a point to watch it. It's free. You can watch it online. So I just want to thank again our co-presenters, Vermont ACLU, VPIRG, the Vermont League of Women Voters, Disability Rights Vermont, and the Jonathan Daniels Center for Social Responsibility. This could not have happened without you guys. We appreciate it. And also Brattleboro Community Television, BCTV, thank you so much for the technical support. We would like to open up to these questions from some of our viewers. I think Secretary Condos, this first one is most relevant to you, but anybody in Vermont or in the panel can answer it. Secretary Condos, have you been made aware of any current issues with Vermont ballots and mail-in voting? And what might you do differently, if anything, in the future?
The first thing I guess I would say is, yeah, we've heard a few isolated incidents where multiple ballots have gone to the same address. One of the things that I think happens is people do forget to contact their town clerk to change their address. They don't forget to contact the DMV. Our voter registration database is considered to be one of the more accurate ones across the country. But at the same time, I will tell you, there is no perfect system out there. There will be errors on every checklist across this country. You know, one of the big claims that we hear is there's dead people on the checklist. Well, dead people don't call us up to tell us to take their name off, and it takes time for those things to process. We also have strict federal law that we follow when we go to remove someone from our voter checklist. It's not as simple as someone just calling up and saying, you know, oh, I think this person moved, therefore you can take them off. There's a little more work to it that has to go out, and it's actually done at the local level. So I think, you know, what we will do after this election is over is we plan to meet with a group of diverse clerks from around the state, large towns, small towns, urban versus suburban or rural. And we plan to debrief and say, okay, what worked, what didn't, what can we do better, and have that discussion. before the legislature even starts. And then we'll have further discussions with the legislature. I think it's, you know, we hear all the time that because more than one ballot went to a particular address, that means it's voter fraud. No, that doesn't mean it's voter fraud. It would only be voter fraud if more than one person voted, if someone who isn't the intended receipt of that ballot was to vote. So we know where every ballot has been sent. We know we've actually added we've printed on the certificate envelope on the backside the name, the voter ID number, and a barcode for the clerks to be able to process. Yes, people have to sign their ballots, the certificate envelope, under penalty of perjury. And we have yet to see any actual voter fraud where someone unintentionally or intentionally votes for someone else. It just doesn't exist. I mean, the Brennan Center did a study, I think Brianna, it ended in 2015. Justin Levitt from Loyola University did a study of over 1 billion votes that were cast between 2000 and 2014 of local, state, and federal races. And he found potentially 31 instances that might be a voter fraud. They weren't proven at the time. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is it's very minimal, very, you know, if you look, one of the things that gets thrown at us is the Heritage Foundation numbers. There's 1,300 on their list. Well, their list goes back almost 40 years. And if you actually measure that out against how many ballots were cast in the same time, it's like 0.0000006%. You know, I mean, it's a very minuscule amount. Do we strive for perfect system? Yes, absolutely. We want free, fair, and accurate elections.
Great.
But, you know, we're not going to get there by just having these debates. We need to actually work on it.
Yeah. Thank you, Secretary Condos. It's inspiring for me. I just moved to Vermont this year, and to know the effort that the state is going through to ensure that the access to the ballot box is really encouraging. And I would love to see more states tackle this in a more kind of a genuine fashion.
Including where you came from, Florida.
Yeah. So Paul, I just want to talk about VPIRG. We spoke about briefly about Protect the Results, but I would love to hear more about what VPIRG is doing with Protect the Results and how you guys are preparing post-election.
Yeah, well, as everybody knows, President Trump has refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power should he lose the election. And, you know, it's amazing that we can even say those words now. I mean, it should be shocking. It is shocking to all of us who care about democracy. I think that we are in a situation where a leading candidate, much less the president, would say such a thing or would fail to commit to upholding the most fundamental aspect of democracy, which is that peaceful transfer of power. But if we come to a situation post-election day where he appears to be holding on to power, refusing to give up power, if there is a clear victory for the former Vice President Biden, or if President Trump is declaring victory before all the votes have been counted, which of course is a real possibility because it may take some time, some days even, for certain of these states to count all of their votes, particularly the mail-in ballots. And President Trump is pushing hard to say, oh, we're only going to count the votes that come in on election day. So we believe that it may be necessary for Americans across the country who care about our democracy to stand up for democracy in mass mobilizations. And in Vermont, VPIRG and Rights and Democracy, another excellent organization, and lots of others have come together to reserve the State House lawn. From about 5 o'clock on Wednesday the 4th. We'll have a coming together of folks at that time. There will be other events, presumably in other locations around the state. We'll have another large gathering on the Saturday the 7th. as necessary. I mean, my hope is, of course, that none of this is necessary and that we don't have these challenges to our fundamental democratic system here. But if it is necessary, then I think we must participate safely, of course, but to come together in every state and in Washington, D.C., and to make it known that we will not tolerate this kind of refusal to abide by the rules of the game. And this game is our democracy. And so it is vitally important, just incredibly important. So I say you can find more information about that. Protect the results. There's actually information about all 50 states. And again, there'll be a link to that in the comments section there. If you want to host an event or join an event, I encourage you to get on there and participate and sign up, because it's going to be really important. Well, it could be really important. Hope that it won't be, but there it is.
Thank you, Paul. By the way, our church bells, we ring them every night at 8 p.m. We've done so for about 6 or 7 months for the whole town in an act of solidarity. So everybody comes out and bangs on pots and pans. So if you hear the church bell, that's what's going on. I wanted to open up a question. Somebody had asked about safeguards to the vote. And so Falko and Brianna, I'd love to hear what you're seeing around the country in terms of what other states are doing to safeguard the vote and to make sure that the election happens as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take that and then pass it over to Brianna quickly. But this is something that the ACLU and affiliates around the country are looking at very closely, and we filed lawsuits in many different jurisdictions trying to ensure that people have safe access to the ballot box in places that are trying to restrict that type of access. But it's something that we are looking at. We filed lawsuits around the country and are continue to look at. I'm not exactly sure which safeguards you're looking for. Whether it's trying to make sure that people have safe access to the ballot boxes, or if it's the type of safeguards that Secretary Condos has already talked about in terms of making sure that our elections are fair and that we are making sure that we are having people who are registered to vote have the opportunity to vote. But I'll pass it over to Brianna if she wants to add some more.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of safeguarding the election, one thing that we've been talking a lot about with our Generation Vote students and with our allies around the country, working with college students in particular, is how can young people help safeguard our elections during a national pandemic, right? And so if you are a younger person on this call who is watching, the 2 ways that we are encouraging folks to make sure that our elections are not only fair, but also safe for folks is to, one, if you haven't already, maybe depending on where you live, it might be a little bit late depending on deadlines, but one, signing up to be an election worker in your community. So that's one thing that we've been pushing as a partner of Power to the Polls, is making sure that we are safeguarding our elections by making sure that our election sites are actually being run efficiently, right? And have enough workers. And because of the pandemic, a lot of folks who are usually older do not feel safe and are more at risk. So we are encouraging young folks to, one, help us by signing up to be election workers in your local community. The second thing that we are encouraging young people and just also all folks in general to do to help safeguard our elections at the grassroots level is to sign up to be an election protection volunteer. And so there is a national coalition called Election Protection, also known as 866 Our Vote, that recruits folks, everyday people, to understand how you can protect the election in your community, whether it be monitoring poll sites and being trained in a nonpartisan manner to do that. Or 2, if you don't feel comfortable to actually travel to poll sites during the pandemic, to help us monitor social media online and make sure that we are catching misinformation or problems at polling sites in your communities. So those are the 2 ways that we are pushing folks on the grassroots level to help safeguard our elections. And I support all our allies in the courts and also folks who are pushing for reforms to make sure that we have safe and fair elections this November and October.
Thank you, Brianna.
Keith, can I jump in a little?
Please.
Looking at that question, I think the concern was about vote by mail, and obviously Trump's maintaining that vote by mail is rife with fraud. There are currently 5 states that actually do all vote by mail: Colorado, Utah, And they're not all blue states: Colorado, Utah, Washington, Hawaii, and Oregon. And they have actually less voter fraud than the states that do, traditional voting. And it's a very well run, very, they ballots have barcodes, you can actually track your ballot. They have ballot boxes that you can go to and in town centers and so forth. It's a very rigorous, with higher integrity way of voting. It's not, rife with fraud. So I just want to assure everyone that vote by mail is a good way to vote, and it's as high integrity as the traditional way.
Tim, that kind of leads me into our, well, let's call this our final question to set up Secretary Condos one last time. What are the, it's kind of a two-part question for you. What are the best practices? Are there states looking at best practices to sort of, in any professional setting, we're looking for best practices to run our organizations, our businesses. And so is there a conversation happening around throughout the country for Secretary of States for best practices? And also what if any pull do you have with other Secretary of States to show that Vermont is a model of allowing people a safe and secure way to vote?
Wow. So I'm a past president of the National Association of Secretaries. It's the oldest nonpartisan government officials association that exists. We've been in existence for over 100 years, and we really do pride ourselves on being nonpartisan, and we work really hard to maintain that, if you want to call it, stability. So if anybody wants to push a resolution forward, there has to be 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats that sponsor it. Every one of our committees, whether it's the election committee, a corporations committee, whatever, they all have a Republican and a Democratic co-chair. The problem is we've got 50 states and we're all over the map on these issues of elections and voting. And sometimes the work that we do at the National Association is really more around preventing partisan politics from entering into the picture. And so that is frustrating at times, but I can also tell you, I forget, there's like 26 Republicans and 22 Democrats or something like that that are secretaries of state. And we both have our own partisan groups, and we meet and talk, and we often will have those meetings at the same time we're having our national meetings, and just have those conversations. But also we're in groups like this where we discuss these issues, and I can call up any one of my secretaries, other states, and talk to them. So if I hear, Oregon, the current governor of Oregon was a former Secretary of State when I first got elected as secretary. And I've had many conversations with her over the years about how Oregon did it. The same with Washington has a Republican secretary, and she's been very instrumental in providing input for vote by mail across the country. And you have to remember, like, for instance, one of the things that has been said is Washington said that it took them 5 years to put it in place. But that was, I guess I'll call it, the election management systems that we had at the time were old, legacy. Most of them were legacy systems that couldn't do the things that we do today. Vermont put a new election management system in place in the fall of 2015. And we're one of the best in the country as far as our election management system. In fact, just to give you an example, MIT has a election performance index, which they do after every general election. It started with the Pew Charitable Trust and then flipped over to MIT. It's a data-driven system, and they pull the data that we provide to the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, to actually create state rankings. So my first election was 2012. We were ranked 38th in the nation. In 2014, we were ranked 16th in the nation. By 2016, after our new election management system, we were #1 in the nation. And this year, after the 2018, we were ranked #3. We dropped a little bit, but that's because 2 of the states had put in new systems on top of theirs. So they did go up a little, but we're still in the top 3 in the country. And to me, a lot of what we do, a lot of the stuff around security, around access, is really about the management systems that we use to provide the access that we need.
Wow. Well, Secretary of State, thank you so much for doing the hard work of ensuring voting rights in the state of Vermont. Thank you for being on the panel. I want to thank Paul Burns, Executive Director from VPIRG, Falko Schilling from ACLU of Vermont, Brianna Sia, Generation Vote, Tim Smith from the American Issues Initiative. And Tim, will you also kind of tell people where they can see the film?
Yes, thank you. If people want to see the film, it's available for free on Amazon Prime if you're an Amazon Prime person, and it's also available on our website. You just have to go to www.rigthefilm.com, and it's there for free. So just check it out.
Great. We really encourage everybody to watch it. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our co-presenters, Vermont ACLU, VPIRG, the Vermont League of Women Voters, Disability Rights Vermont, and the Jonathan Daniels Center for Social Responsibility. We want to say thank you to BCTV. They've been, as usual, incredible to work with. They are handling all the technical aspects of this. And I'm Keith Marks. I'm the Executive Director from Next Stage Arts. The whole point of this is to encourage you to get out and vote. So please, if you haven't sent in your mail-in ballots, send them in. And if you're not sending them in, we really encourage you to vote on November 3rd. So thank you so much. And with that, we'll say thank you. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith.